are part of contemporary literary events and translation initiatives that have taken place between Australia and Indonesia for many years. This event will explore the promotion of Indonesian literature in Australia, focusing on reading literature and exchanges between Indonesia and Australian writers and publishers in a post-pandemic context. Importantly, we will consider how literature works to enrich cultural exchange between Indonesia and Australia, and also, perhaps thinking also about Nusantara, how about these connections and conversations, among us in the archipelago, and how can we navigate these islands, these networks, these conversations to build a more sustainable initiatives through literature and translation. So you can follow us if you'd like to. Oh wait, hang on. This program is supported by the Centre for Stories, Western Australia. Hide non participants feature, which is all participants, please deactivate your Zoom microphone. So put yourselves on mute. And if you have any questions, and write them in the chat room. So people in the live room, we'll have time also for you to ask questions. Okay, for those who'd like to publish this event on your social media, please include the hashtag at WIWMIW, it's at Rumata_Artspace, and also the Makassar International Writers Festival, which is at Makassar Writers. So please tweet us so that we spread out from this home in Rumata Artspace out into the world. And now I'd like to introduce our 4 panelists who have been very patiently waiting here. We have 3 in the room with us, and we have Andy Fuller, who's in Jakarta, and joining us via Zoom. So who is from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. He's a researcher, translator, and co-founder of Reading Sideways Press. He gained his PhD at the University of Tasmania in Australia, undertaking research on the urban literature of Indonesian author Seno Gumira Adjidharma. Andy has a number of published works on contemporary Indonesian literature, religious freedom, and football fandom. Our second guest is Rain Chudori. Rain is an Indonesian author, curator, multidisciplinary artist, and actress. She is the founder and writer of books and has published several books. And also, Rain was the guest editor for the 5th issue of Port, focused on connecting across the Indian Ocean. So their 5th issue was bilingual, celebrating the work of 16 Indonesians of the Archipelago Writers Collective, which emerged between refugee communities in Indonesia and whole space for transnational literature. Kiran co-founded Archipelago Journal, which has as its ambition to document Bornean Australian author and poet from Queanbeyan, Australia. He has released 3 poetry books, including Parang and Mil Fiori, 4 hip-hop records, written and acclaimed one-man play, Since Ali Died, and received a standing ovation at TEDx Sydney at the Sydney Opera House. His debut novel, Here Come the Dogs, was published in 2014 and was longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award and the Miles Franklin Award. Omar was named one of the Sydney Morning Herald in 2015. Was published in 2021. It's available at the bookshop outside and is being launched in Kota Kinabalu and Kuala Lumpur in July. So welcome to all 4 of our very talented guests who work in very many different areas in promoting, encouraging, supporting cultural exchange. So today's panel, we have about 45 minutes, and I'm hoping it will be a free-flowing discussion. We're going to start with, I'll ask a general question of each of our guests, and then we'll have a reading by two of our, and then another question and another reading so that you can hear their work as well as hear them talk about their work. And Kieran, we have two special guests who are coming in to read, who are writers who are published in Archipelago. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a general, broad question, but I think what people are most interested in is hearing about your work, so could you, and maybe each of you in turn, maybe in the order that I read out your bios, I'll remind you. So tell us about the work that you do as a creative, as an academic, or dare I say, as an activist, as a translator, in your work in between cultures. Do you see your work as other, different cultures, opening up worlds, connecting, not just Australia and Indonesia, but maybe Nusantara, thinking of Australia as part of this already established connection? Maybe we can start with Omar.
Sure. I like to create work that is borderless, whether that's stylistically or through the form that I use, or also borderless when it comes to identity. Oftentimes in Australia, where I was born and raised, we are forced into categories or boxes that I think are very restrictive and diminish us as soon as we're put into them, whether that comes to our religious identity, our national identity, or our identity as artists. So work that I create, a hyphenated space in between cultures, Muslim, Australian, Asian, Australian, Bornean, Australian, but also as an artist. So I create work that moves between hip-hop, visual art, novel writing, and poetry. I define myself as an artist and as a human being, and I explore that complex, nuanced, sometimes paradoxical space.
Rain?
So with me, I feel like I'm playing two roles. The first is my work as an author, which feels like a very solitary, transitory feeling, emotion. And the second is my work as a curator, where I run the Comma Books imprint with a lot of writers across the archipelago. And in terms of my our curatorial work, our purpose is to look beyond Asianness of everything, because when I speak to the writers and the artists that I work with, what does it mean to be Indonesian? What does it mean to have all of these sort of, I hate the word diverse, but all of these different, complicated, complex identities in terms of our religion, ethnicity, gender, and so on. So I think the most important part of our curatorial work is not to look at Indonesia as a collective whole, but to explore our more regional heritage, more regional identities. Because for me personally, when somebody, it's easier to say I'm an Indonesian artist. It's just or an Indonesian writer, curator. But for me, it's beyond that. I'm Minang. I am, I'm Minang. I grew up a nomad. I will always be a nomad. That is one of the most important identities that I hold. My faith, which even though it's very personal, it is also, there are communities that I share my faith with. Yeah, so and I work with writers and artists who look beyond their Indonesianness, wherever their ethnicity and heritage and loyalties lie. Yeah, and what I would really love for Indonesia is for us to publish more works that are faithful to the region. I want to see Minang literature. I want to see like languages, all these different languages, instead of just looking at Indonesia as okay, it's this one big archipelago that is collective, but our individuality, I feel, is much more important than what Indonesia is. Okay, cool.
Thanks, Rain. My work with the archipelago emerged from working with refugee communities around Indonesia. And the way that we started working together was that I asked various people in these refugee communities, do you want to be a writer? Or actually, are you already a writer? And we were met with a resounding response from so many creatives, artists, visual artists, writers, filmmakers in refugee communities here in this archipelago. And together we built a writers collective over the past 3-4 years. And what we're working to do is to make creative work that foregrounds our members and our writers as writers, artists, thinkers, that works with refugee communities not to show their witness statement of what they may be experiencing, not to show them as giving testimony to hardship, but actually to work with people who are intellectuals, to think of them and read them for their creativity. And really the heart of the archipelago is relationship and expressing and also exposing relationships that already exist. Deep relationships between, for example, Australia and Indonesia, where refugee people are in a very intimate relationship because of violence and colonial bordering policies, but also thinking about relationships across various islands of Indonesia, about thinking of how language slips and slides together when we have many writers, for example, from Afghanistan writing in Persian and bringing together Farsi, Dari, Hazaragi words together with English, creolizing language, and making a relationship that is rhizomal, that is complex, that has varied roots, and building relationships between writers across islands. Thank you.
Thank you. And Andy?
Out of a desire um, in to put together English language fiction written by Australian authors in amongst works published by or written by Indonesian authors. And so at the time of founding Reading Sideways Press, I felt that Indonesian literature was often categorized as a separate space, as something that it was reserved for exclusive specialist publishers. Over the past several years, that has changed with the success of um, uh, works by Eka Kurniawan or Intan Paramadita, and more recently, I think Norman Pasaribu. But what I found to be one of the motivating factors for us was to take Indonesian literature into an Australian publishing space where the literature wasn't presented in a kind of white Australia colonial gaze towards Indonesia. And so we are trying slowly to do our little bit, but we are also publishing works in Indonesian and for an Indonesian audience. So we do hope to represent to represent, yeah, a kind of multiple and plural but we will do our bit one author at a time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. the way that, each of your initiatives, we can talk about the kind of broad partnership, between Indonesia and Australia and how those connections are made. But each of you, it seems to me, are making those connections, as Andy said, one person at a time. So the person-to-person connections, linking people, that like Lily's book, pointed out, linking people person to person initiatives are really important on the ground. I'm hoping that we can hear, you've described your work, but now it would be really good to hear you read some of that work, and maybe we can start, since we made you go last, Andy, that maybe you could read first and show us the work. Tell us what you'll be reading and why you're reading it today.
Thank you, Beth. So first of all, I'm reading something which is effectively off the record because I have not published this, and it is me reading you something as a fan of this author's work. So this is just an introduction to express my enthusiasm for this author's work, whose name is Ziggy Zezia Ziovena Seber. I'm going to read it in Indonesian first, because it's important to have Indonesian language present when we talk about Indonesian literature, and then I'll read my translation. Hari Rabu, tanggal 26 Juni 2013. Di berbagai belahan dunia, sekarang berdasarkan perhitungan cuaca adalah musim panas. Kecuali di Australia. Tempat aneh itu tidak pernah setuju soal perhitungan cuaca. Mama yang memberitahuku, katanya, kalau seluruh dunia sedang kedinginan, Australia akan kepanasan. Begitu pula sebaliknya. Bagian dalam rumahku seperti Australia. Di luar adalah seluruh dunia yang lain. Di luar panas. Menurut penyiar berita di televisi, suhu di luar di atas 33 derajat Celcius. Langitnya tampak biru seperti boneka penguin milikku. Mama yang membelikan boneka penguin itu. Aku sudah memiliki boneka penguin itu selama 6 tahun. Kata Mama, bicara hal yang tidak saling berhubungan itu disebut meracau. Katanya, anak-anak suka meracau, seperti nenek-nenek dan kakek-kakek. Jadi aku ulangi lagi, bagian dalam rumahku seperti Australia. Di luar adalah seluruh dunia yang lain. Di luar panas. Menurut penyiar berita di televisi, suhu di luar di atas 33 derajat Celcius. Langitnya, it is hot. It is 33 degrees Celsius, according to the weather report. The sky is blue like my toy penguin. Mama was the one who bought this penguin. So I'll repeat it again. The interior of my house is like Australia. Outside is a different world. Outside it is hot. It is 33 degrees Celsius, according to the weather report. The sky is blue like my toy penguin. That's the end of my translation.
Thank you for that wonderful reading. And now our second reader, Rain.
Okay. So this is an unpublished work too. It's something I worked on when I was doing my residency in New York. Okay. In front of the Miriam Cinema 2, there is sweeping to be finished. In the absence of flowers, there are cigarettes, paper cups, film pamphlets, remnants from last evening's audience, or perhaps ordinary pedestrians looking for a brief escape from the rain. A photograph of a recently departed filmmaker and a list of his films scheduled to screen for the week hangs next to the ticket booth. Find yourself first so you can find me, handwritten in Urdu on the faded green walls. The director of the cinema walks me through the charred corridor. We discuss the filmmaker's body of work, his political exile, his undisguised love for dark-haired actresses. He asked me how long I would be staying. As long as you'll have me, I told him. I'll be here for a while. I have things to take care of. He places his hands on my shoulder. It felt like the gentle stroke of sunlight, and we continued to walk through the long sunlit hall. And then we spoke about the fire, because now this is what binds us. Because now this is how everything begins. Where were you when it happened? How did you survive? Who did you lose? Who did you betray? He tells me how the fire had taken everything, how a man who had come every Friday evening, who watched films with devotion, who spoke to them, knew their names by heart, had told what happened. When they didn't appear the week after, and that as they exited slowly in the dark, they realized that no one would ever enter this room again. That's how violence begins, he says. They come into our rooms and then they ask us to leave God behind. And what happened? The one who had warned you. He was the first to light the torch. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. That was very moving, Ray. That's how violence enters our rooms. I have a second question now for everybody, and then we'll have the other two readings afterwards. It's a bit, again, like a general question, but thinking about it in terms of your own work. How much work is there to be done in terms of bringing cultures together, creating conversations across islands? I mean, what is Australia except a really big island that pretends to be something else? The weather is always different there. So how much is there to be done, do you think, in this area and peripheries between Indonesia, and I'm speaking here of Makassar as the center and Australia as a periphery, depending on where we are, right? What is central and what is periphery? So just a few kind of provocative remarks, but thinking about how much is there to be done in terms of creating sustainable initiatives of connecting people in this new post-pandemic world.
I'm going to answer first, if that's okay. I think there is so much work to be done. Australians generally, orang di Australia tidak tahu apa-apa saja tentang Indonesia, ya. There's no frame of reference for Indonesia or Malaysia or Southeast Asia. When I was growing up in the 90s, Australia was trying to think of itself maybe as part of the region a little bit more. But now it's reverted back to thinking like Australia is a place, just an outpost of the British colonial empire. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in rethinking Australia's place in this region and its connections to a place like Indonesia or Malaysia. And a small example that might be Sejarah Makassar, the connections, the historical connections between Makassar and orang asli di Australia, right? Hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years of trade and connection. Australians don't know this history, an important history, an alternative sejarah, right? And so I think the best way to do that may be through these type of connections, personal connections and artistic connections.
I just have a follow-up question for Omar. How does this work with your work that is borderless, that doesn't kind of say it's any one Queen center for you?
I think because this is a borderless region, Nusantara, so many thousands of islands, exchange and cross-pollination between cultures. I try to represent that. I'm going to do a poem in a little bit about this, that within my own identity, I have different histories and identities. How can you fix it just to one? It's impossible. And so I try to reflect that in this work. And I take a lot of inspiration from the history of Makassar, actually, in my work. And all of these people going backwards and forwards in the Pinisi over the years, exchanging goods and ideas.
Thank you.
I'm really fascinated by maps, and the work that I'm interested in doing and also encouraging and infusing is how can we remap this region? And how does literature, how does art do this kind of remapping? How does it make new maps and new cartographies? Like Omar was saying, there's so much relationship and historical connection between Australia as an island and Makassar as part of the Malay trade route that used to come up from Arnhem Land in northern Australia, through Makassar and on, through Malaysia to China to many other islands. And in the context of refugee communities, their movements and their different travels around this region, a region of islands and archipelago, or a myriad of archipelagos, is doing this kind of remapping, is seeing Australia as merely one of these islands in a region, and is also capturing the colonial cartography of Australia. Australia came into being when it was first mapped by Matthew Flinders, who drew the first map of the Australian coastline as one island, as a mainland. And so the work that we have to do now, I think, is to remap, is to show what are the other that crisscross between these islands. And then how do we do that? How do we do that through relationship together? How do we do that through writing and art that is transnational, that goes beyond being Indonesian or Australian or indeed Afghan or Somali, but brings together a new map? And that's what the archipelago tries to do as well, both visually through our website where we map our work, but also through the relationship that we are a group of writers and a group of artists that is showing this kind of connection across islands, disregarding or indeed subverting nation, border, colonial cartography.
I love the way that you recap places, Kieran. You know, so you describe Afghanistan and Somalia as islands, bringing them, in a sense, into Nusantara. I mean, on the archipelago website. Is that part of your work then? The whole, you know, which I think of as very far away, non-consequential to Australia or to Indonesia, into the orbit of island key.
To shift what is the center. And I think what's really important in Indonesia and Makassar, where we are now, is that refugee people can be seen as isolated, that there's little awareness and little relationship between local communities and refugee communities who are living side by side in and among each other. And actually, what we're trying, the refugee part of Indonesia are living here for a decade or longer, are a part of the story of these islands. And so we want to show how these relationships already exist and then make them deeper.
Great, thank you. Ray?
There's a lot of work to be done for sure. I think that if I'm talking about, you know, in the last 2 years has been one of the most difficult moments for everyone. But for writers and artists, there was almost no support from the industry that we work in the industry that we've contributed our lives to. And I'm talking about very, very large publishers, very large organizations, very large institutions who used to give us platforms, who used to give us resources and space. Not a lot, but there was something. And then the pandemic happened, and what we saw was massive, massive exploitation of writers and artists, in particular writers. in which we were asked to work for free. Not just writers, but people who work within the literary industry. And I think the past 2 years have been such an embarrassing moment for Indonesian literary institutions, just terrible and shameful. And was that during these 2 years of being massively exploited by our local industry, no, that actually gave us space and gave us dignity to write again, to create again. They gave us resources, they gave us platforms, they gave us our livelihood back. They very grateful. But also, I'm talking sort of about the mechanics of the industry, I guess, because this has this is lately an industry that hasn't given us any dignity to do the work that a lot of people were consuming during the pandemic. So people are reading our books, people are reading our writings, but the industry wants us to do it for free. Yeah, so that's the work, I think, to give us our livelihood and to give us the right. Yeah. Thank you.
All artists and all writers are really, what you're saying is really resonating with everyone. That the past 2 years really, the arts kept people alive, and the spaces up for people, have also been really important. So spaces through your tuition and through your edit of the comma imprint. Spaces for, gender difference, for diversity. I just had a follow-up question about, what about nomads? Is there space for nomads in all of this, in your work?
I think if we go back to the roots of Indonesia or Indonesianness, a majority of us are actually nomads. A lot of us aren't rooted into our lands because of capitalism, because of colonialism, because of our desire and our survival instinct to protect our land. But we have always been travelers. We have always been in transit. And that would be a really central thing if our industry was supportive enough to let us return to our roots as travelers. That's actually a really good point because I had a really big conflict with one of a major institute here, who had issue with a lot of our writers and literary workers being nomads because they wanted to keep us in the office. And I think that's not where artists thrive. We do not belong in an office. We don't belong in a 9 to 5 cubicle. And that's something that I think the local industry need to change.
Yeah, artist as pengembara kan. Yeah, thank you. Andy, what kind of work do you think needs to be done?
Yeah, this is such great answers. I also want to pick up on what Omar was saying. I was studying Indonesian in the 1990s, and back then there was a top, a governmental level of interest in Indonesia, which, although that could be criticized for its own kind of politics, that kind of will of someone like Paul Keating has totally disappeared up and over the last 20 plus years, where there's been so much fear generated regarding Indonesia and Islam and all of this. So over the years, mainstream Indonesia interest in Indonesia has just dropped off the perch. But I would also feel, I feel that the main obligation of cultural workers in Australia is to contribute to the decolonization of the continent of Australia. And I pretty much am deliberately trying only to refer to Australia as a continent rather than as a nation, because for me, the continent of Australia is a nation home to First Nations peoples whose sovereignty was never succeeded. So we have seceded. So we have to always respect that and to acknowledge that, in the words of one of my favorite activists, Robbie Thorpe, was Australians are aliens. In the second half of the word is the word alien. So when he talks about white Australians, he's talking about aliens. And so for us, I feel that our obligation is to decolonize Australia through an awareness or giving of sovereignty to the discourse of what this continent is. Firstly, to the indigenous voices and peoples of the continent. And yeah, as a secondary step, engaging more widely with the different routes of trade, knowledge exchange, which the other participants have already discussed. So for me, it's no coincidence that Centre for Stories, which published Rain's selection of Indonesian authors, Centre for Stories is very strongly grounded in the Indigenous heritage and activists and writers of the Noongar region in Western Australia. So they are able to engage locally, but also engage to the north. And I don't feel like, whenever I'm in Melbourne or Naarm, I don't feel like I'm at a periphery. I feel like I'm on Wurundjeri land. And I don't long for Europe, and I don't necessarily long for Indonesia. I feel it's a privilege when I'm in Melbourne or Naarm to engage and listen to the Indigenous voices and people of the Melbourne region. Thank you. I can't hear.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, so just a quick follow-up, Andy. Do you think that Australia, so-called Australia, will be more open towards, you know, the kinds of connections, the kinds of renamings that you talked about, now that we have a new government?
Yeah, maybe, but I think we cannot put our faith in politicians because they'll betray us at the first step. We have to put our faith in cultural organizations which are run independently, and we have to establish interpersonal connections. For me, that's the only way to go. And I feel privileged to be having had a relationship with Indonesia as a country, but with so many wonderful writers over the past 20 years. And I always feel that the beneficiaries of this exchange is always too much. I feel like I'm the beneficiary. So my will is to be able to contribute more within the Indonesian literary space, because that's repeating of a colonial power relationship where it's the foreigner who benefits rather than the host. So yeah, but yeah, I try not to be too optimistic, so to avoid disappointment.
The alien, I think, you know, even if we open up and just question who are the aliens, you know, wherever we are, that's a first step.
And I started thinking about this word tanah air, you know, homeland, and that it needs the two elements in an archipelago, tanah and air. Tapi di Kalimantan, di sejarah Kalimantan, traditionally there's a lot of conflict between orang tanah and orang air, orang laut. Tapi dalam darahku saya ada dua, right? Like I got the blood of orang tanah and orang air. So this is my version. Aku tan air. I am a homeland. weighted to the ocean floor by a moral conundrum. On the waking edge between forested life and limitless sleep, sand is scalloped like an ear. It hears, listens, fizzes, rustles. Hold breath like confession, sayang, now let it go in rhythm. Inhale, I am singular. Exhale, I appear in many places. South, southwest, the pirate winds go through my slatted bones, bind me in smoke. Romanticism fattens and bloats around the liver. Realpolitik and electroshock to the heart. Coins sink upwards out of my pores and charita are engraved with my blood. There are durian husks and potato skins on these shores. Inhale, I am yearning. Exhale, I am inconsequence. I am anger. Exhale, I am acceptance. At times I am glacial peak and polar ice cap, but hard shards, sharp from chiseling, melt and become the rising tide. The eagle's swell swoops to tempest of nature like me. The monsoonal flow state over the loose leaf, the Bruce Lee when he says be like water. Inhale, I am cliche. Exhale, I am impossible to bear, it seems these days, but the words tana and air combine me, people warring but remember, the tide reverses often, and I am no one. Hold up. I am no one thing. Inhale. Exhale. Terima kasih ya.
That felt extremely exhilarating and meditative at the same time. To do with breathing, breathing, who are you? What does the breath hold? Our second reader or host for the two other readers from Archipelago is Kieran. And Kieran, you're going to introduce our guest readers.
I'd like to introduce two poets in the Archipelago Writers Collective. They live here in Makassar, and I'm thrilled that they're with us today. So let me read out their short bio, and as I do, Asadullah and Ali Reza, please come and sit with us. Ali Reza Yawari is a Hazara writer and filmmaker. He is also a volunteer researcher in the RDI Urban Refugees Group. And Asadullah Amiri, to my right, is a writer, a volunteer teacher, and an athlete. He is an Afghan refugee in Indonesia. Welcome, Asadullah. Welcome, Ali Reza. Asadullah, would you thank you for sharing your work with us.
Hello, everybody. Respected brother and sister in the panel, in the audience, and of course, in those guys through the Zoom meeting. I am Asadullah Amiri, an Afghan refugee. It is my 10th year that I am here in Indonesia. Most of the time, I have been in Makassar city. So I cannot call myself a poet or a writer because there are the very big writers, amazing, and so just as Maulana says that poetry or writing it's like an ocean, and we are glad to sip off of it. And yeah, I sometimes read some poems in my own language, which is Hazari and Dari, and sometimes in English. So I am going to deliver you one of my poems, which is about a father's letter to his daughter. You know that the refugees that is 10 years that they are stranded here. They are far away from their loved ones, and so this poem is about a father who sends a letter back those who are in Afghanistan or to their homeland. A refugee father's letter to his dear sweetheart, my angel. It is me, your father, that you may not know and may not remember. Because you were too small in the cradle, tiny and delicate, like a beautiful fresh blossom when I left home and Zara Salam. I am here in Indonesia, far away from you in sadness and grief, in another land's corner in Asia. Stuck in limbo in an evergreen jungle by the name of refugee, by the name of single. They know that I have you. They know that I have you in a war-torn country at the hands of the devils in unsecured boundary. But still in their book, my name is single, your name is married, your dad is forgotten, stranded in limbo, punished for crimes he hasn't committed. My lovely flower, my dear sweetheart, remember that I miss you, desperately dying to hug you, to kiss you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asadullah. Welcome, Ali Reza.
Thank you so much, Kieran. Thank you, everyone in the panel. Thank you all here. The introduction is done by Kieran. Thank you so much. I would like to say a little bit about the short poem that I'm going to read. This is the words by words, piece by piece of 8 years in the detention in Indonesia for Hazara refugees from Afghanistan. This is actually started since my age of 15 years old for 8 years until now. This is going to be a short poem, but this is the story of a long suffering. Give me a piece of land. Give me a piece of land where I bury my body, but not my soul. Where I bury my despair of letdown, but not the thrill of my well done. Give me a piece of land where I dream, but not scream. Where I train, but not detain. Give me a piece of land, just a piece of land. Give me a piece of land where I can plant my bad seeds, but not to uproot my bad deeds. Where I honor my pride, but not conceal my flaws. Where I start a life of tries, and to stop a life of cries. Give me a piece of land, a lease of hand, home and ambition, where I crow and grow and flow in the desert of Trump, where I throw my pains away and heal the flesh and bones of clay, where I flame the torch of my dreams, but not crack the ties of my griefs. Give me a piece of land, just a piece of land. And give me a piece of land where I can play for my health, but not pray for my death. Where I please my soul, but not release my thorns. Where I bury my body, but not my soul. Give me a piece of land, just a piece of land. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ali Reza and Asadullah, for those wonderful poems. I feel like we should take a minute to absorb all of those readings coming from different islands. You can be in a country and be on an island within a country. So we ran a bit late. I'm hoping we have a little bit more time for questions, maybe about 20 minutes. Yeah. So I'm gonna open the floor now for questions from our audience on Zoom or in the room. So the audience on Zoom, you may have been writing your questions in the chat already, and I will read out some of the questions. And you can write them in now as well. Reski is going to bring them to me, I think. And in the room, if anybody has any questions for our panelists and our guest readers, please do come up and I'll pass the mic to you.
Baik, terima kasih. Mungkin untuk para audiens yang ingin bertanya, dipersilakan nanti akan dibantu translate ke dalam bahasa Inggris. Terima kasih.
Karen, and could share how actually you connect with our friends in Makassar and other places in Indonesia, and how actually you see the difference between places. And I know that poetry is way to express.
Thank you so much, Lily, for your question about connection. Connection and meeting together with writers like Asadullah, like Ali Reza, is really based on friendship over many years. And so 2018, I've been sitting with and collaborating with various writers, artists, leaders in refugee communities, and it's been a long road of friendship and then of working together. The archipelago is something that we've been collected between a number of writers starting in Jakarta and Bogor, writers like Wasan Wesan, a Somali writer, John Junaid, or a Hinja writer who used to live here in Makassar and was a prolific journalist. Different types of writing, as you asked about, Lily. I think what's really important for our collective is that nobody must write about refugee experiences per se. We've heard today two very powerful poems about the experience of being displaced and of waiting for a decade here in Indonesia. But writers are called to express themselves on humanity in different ways. And I think that that's the most powerful work that we can do, to write freely. And the last part of your question about differences between different islands of Indonesia, I might briefly hand over to Asadullah or Ali Reza, who are based to tell us about, well, what is their experience of Indonesia? Maybe Asadullah, would you briefly tell us about what's your experience here in Makassar?
The experience has been quite hard, challenging, and different, actually, I can say so. Once I have been here in Makassar for for 27 days. Then I was moved to IDC, then from IDC to another city, it's Balikpapan, then again moved from that. It's a long story and different kinds of experiences. But one thing that I have found that so we are amongst Asian, which they are nice and kind, and they have been good with they have been a good host for the refugees, and we appreciate it. So, as you know, refugees have been here for a long time with their fundamental rights, because Indonesia is not signatory of the 1951 convention, so that is why refugees have not their basic rights here. Then freedoms are limited. So, due to this situation, so they have had very difficult and very hard experience and survey.
Thank you.
So here's a question from by Victoria. She really resonated with what Rain observed about our people always having been travelers. Some of you are creatives across Western and Indonesian cultures. Do you find these two identities hard to reconcile at times? And how do you cope with any hardships you face in these terms? So it's about being nomad travelers and your identities across cultures. So she asks, do you have two identities, and how do you reconcile these identities across, in these times? So I guess for Omar, it would be, being Malaysian or being Australian. Maybe it's being Minang and being Indonesian.
What I really appreciate from my own Minang culture, and this is not the only nomadic culture in Indonesia, there are others too, is that we embrace our nomadism. It's very much rooted within our daily life. It's very much rooted within our philosophy, the way we look at the world. We call it merantau, right? So our whole lives, kita adalah perantau gitu. Kita memang dilahirkan untuk merantau, dan kita akan selalu mengenang kampung halaman, dimanapun itu kampung halamannya. And that is the permanent state of being for us, to always be in transit, to always be travelers, and to always long for home. And longing for something doesn't mean that we Minangs will come home and settle permanently. Itu beda untuk setiap orang, itu beda untuk setiap orang Minang. It's not difficult to be a nomad, it's not difficult to be a traveler in that sense. What is very difficult is that when there is sort of like a capitalistic, colonialist lens of being nomads, what is really strange is that I hear a lot of people saying like, "Oh, you're a nomad. That must be commitment issues." And come on, that's such a capitalistic colonialist lens. What are you talking about, commitment issues? We're trying to understand Earth. We're trying to understand the sky. We're trying to understand the oceans. We're trying to understand our souls. Ini tuh apa ya? When we look back towards our own heritage, we must understand that traveling through life is our very essence. So yeah, it's only difficult because now people are looking at it through like a modern lens, which I think is pretty irrelevant. Thanks.
I wonder if others would like to answer this question as well. Andy, do you see yourself as being sighted? I mean, you're living in the Netherlands now, originally from not Tasmania, somewhere in Australia. Yeah, tell us a bit more about your notion of, having an identity that's maybe connected to movement rather than staying in one place.
Yeah. Good question, Beth. But so I think for me, it's been important to discover my, to be better coming to terms with my displacement, yeah? As a white Anglo-Australian growing up in Melbourne, yeah? And my first step away from that comfort of some kind of presumed normality about what it is to be Australian was to speak Indonesian. And of course, coming to Jakarta and having conversations with people on the street, I frequently was confronted with people who knew full well the story and history of white colonial settler Australia, and people who would frequently remind me that this was a nation built on dispossession of indigenous peoples and so, of their lands. And so that was some time ago, that was in the early 2000s. And as a scholar and a researcher, I've never really felt at home in Melbourne / Australia / Tasmania. I did my PhD clearly in Tasmania, but after that, I've never had formal employment in Australia. It's always been in the Netherlands, and I've always done my work I've done work in between Indonesia and the Netherlands. At home, we speak Indonesian. My daughter, for the first 5 or 6 years of her life, always referred to me as being Indonesian. She didn't believe that I wasn't Indonesian because I would always speak to her in Indonesian. And so I felt that was a minor relief in distancing myself from white colonialism. But also coming to Jakarta from being in the Netherlands, I also am made aware of how much clearer it is for so many people here in my everyday conversations to relate clearly to the Netherlands. People might have a joke and say, haha, bekas penjajah, yeah, the former colonizers or whatever. But the Netherlands is something clear in people's daily discourse. But when I say, well, I work in the Netherlands, but I grew up in Australia, oftentimes it's Australia is sort of regarded ambivalently or unclearly, like, what is it? And so that's why I quoted that passage from Ziggy, because in this novel of hers, she refers to Australia as tempat aneh itu, that strange place. She doesn't even call it negara aneh itu, that strange country. She just calls it that strange place. And yesterday I was in Surabaya talking with my friend Afrizal Malna, and he said to me, I said to him, Afrizal, you went to the Netherlands 30 years ago. You don't speak Dutch, you don't speak English, but the Netherlands Literary Festival in Rotterdam, they invited you to come there. Last several months ago, he was invited to Maastricht. He doesn't, just remember, he doesn't speak Dutch or English, but he was invited to their festivals. And I said, what about Australia? And he said, there is, in the imagination of people here, Australia is not clear. Tidak jelas, itu apa? And I kind of agree with that. But in the Netherlands is still clearer and still has a clearer function for so many students, writers, activists, as a place to look for archives, materials, to further education. But I'm not really sure how Australia can fit in with the contemporary realities of Indonesia. And I do hope that there are long-lasting connections made in the manner of what Lily is doing here, so that Indonesian writers are given a clear access and a clear pathway to further their career through writing exchanges or some kind of fellowship if they want to come to Australia or not, And of course, I also think it would be great if Australian fiction by wonderful authors such as Melissa Lukashenko or Alexis Wright or Ellen van Neerven were also published and translated into Indonesian. So we also have to give back rather than just taking. Thank you. I still can't hear if you're talking.
We have a few minutes left. And I think, is there a final question from anyone for our whole panel? And if not, I will ask the final question of what's next. And if you can answer in 30 seconds, that would be really great, or 1 minute of everyone here, starting with Omar.
Next, I'm going back to Kota Kinabalu in Sabah to launch my new book. And then I'm going on a world tour to the UK, Germany, Canada, Nigeria, touring my new book. So yeah, travel, lots of travel. A nomad, just like Rain.
Right now, I returned to Jakarta for a bit because I felt this sort of calling to rebuild what has been destroyed by the pandemic and what a lot of institutions in Indonesia has failed to rebuild. I really want to rebuild several platforms, find resources, and work together with a lot of local writers and artists and see what we can do. I can't talk about like what's concrete and what's not yet, but that's a lot of rebuilding to do in Indo right now.
That's huge work, Ring.
Yeah, just this little corner at least.
What's between Indonesian writers, Indonesian institutions and groups, and refugee communities and writers, artists in our collective. So what's next is looking for people in our audience today who are writers, who are interested, who want to collaborate. We want to make deeper relationships and we want to write together. So that's what's next.
So personally, I myself will have more collaboration with the archipelago, with writing more, and do more research on urban refugee issues to awaken the system that is detaining people for no reason.
Yeah, for me, as you know, that so there are nothing in our hands. We have to go and we have to wait for the process of our resettlement process. So until the time, so we are trying to be patient and trying to be working or just to write or do whatever we were doing. So I hope that we can continue and we can get what we want.
And Andy?
I think for me, it's about, as a publisher, also making or advocating more strongly for Indonesian authors with other publishers and helping to promote their works, even if I myself will not be able to publish them. But also, it's for me to make reading sideways press more open to a variety of translators, authors, particularly translators from Indonesia itself, who've for a long time been excluded from mainstream translations of Indonesian literature. And basically broadening our network so that we do not publish only authors who are writing from like Jakarta or Java, but making sure that our authors come from, you know, the numerous regions of Indonesia. Thank you.
I think we can see from our panel today that all of these panelists in their various roles as writers, as curators, as editors, as publishers, are kind of approaching this question of connecting Indonesia and Australia through translation and improving the partnership from very many different angles. And what came out for me most strongly is the person-to-person connections. You know, as Kieran said, how do you find people? How do writers find their audience? How do you find people to work with who understand the kinds of struggles that you're going through? If you're merantau, if you're a nomad, if you write outside of borders, national borders. And I think the answer is friendship, connections, talking, small initiatives that then actually become large initiatives. Sometimes despite where the state puts its funding, right? All of this work is going on the ground and is so important. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today and sharing the session with us, these thoughts and ideas. I'd just like to inform you about the next program. Have we missed Eko Rizdianto? That's the next program on Menerokong Manusia Sulawesi at the Cafe Sudut Santai. So please go to that. And also please visit MIWF at Rumata Art Space from 10 to 9 p.m. every day. It's open, you know, for this whole week until the 26th of June. In addition to the program panel, there are also special programs such as community discussion, how to create a climate-friendly festival, reading poetry, and every afternoon while enjoying kopi plus teh plus buku, as well as acoustic music, performances, and reading of works in the night stage backyard of Rumata. So sorry everyone from Zoom, you have to imagine this and be here with us in spirit. All MIWF programs can be accessed on YouTube Rumata Art Space. For more information about programs and highlights of MIWF, please visit Instagram at Makassar Writers, Twitter at Makassar Writers, and the website www.makassarwriters.com. So thank you again to all of the speakers and to our sponsors and program partners and friends, and especially those who have been, you know, organizing and manning the technicalities of this hybrid world. Thank you so much for helping us to run this. Thank you to the sign language interpreters and English interpreters who also helped during this event. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Beth. Wow, big audience. Hi, everyone.